think we'll get started and let people trickle in. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Eliza Smith. I'm a volunteer here at the book festival, and I am very excited to listen to Mary and Lisa discuss Alzheimer's and literature and caretaking and all of that today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them, and then I was speaking to them earlier, and their books are very much in conversation together, and they are very much in conversation together. So I'm going to give them the floor. I think we can learn best kind of eavesdropping on their conversation amongst each other. And then towards the end of the hour, we'll turn it over to audience Q&A and have a little bit of a discussion with them. Author Mary Moreland is a lawyer and a single parent of 2 teenage sons. Currently raising her family and practicing law in Houston, Moreland has spent the bulk of her 25-year legal career working on transactions outside the United States, principally in Latin America. In addition to her transactional work, Moreland has vast experience in ethics and compliance matters, having served as chief compliance officer for 2 publicly traded international companies. The gap between marks Moreland's debut as an author. Lisa Solid, author of the novel Shiva and creator and editor of the anthology Desire, Women Write About Wanting, has been published in numerous anthologies, literary journals, newspapers, and magazines for the past 35 plus years. She has 2 grown children and currently lives in Savannah. I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to the book festival, and it's great to be here. I've never been to Montana before, and it's so beautiful, and people stop for you even though there's not a stoplight or a stop sign, which I was like, am I supposed to go? Anyway. So far, yes, so far. Anyway, so, my name's Mary Moreland, and I think my journey with Alzheimer's started in somewhat of what must be a typical way. After a long period of denial of, things aren't quite right with Mom, we finally realized after an insane evening that she needed to go to a doctor and get checked out. She did. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. My father was alive at that time, and I knew eventually I would step into his shoes. I'm the youngest, the only girl, always very close to my mom. And then one day on a weekend, he passed away in his sleep. And I immediately stepped into those shoes for the next decade, basically, taking care of her throughout the stage of the disease. And my book, it's so interesting because our books are both about Alzheimer's, but they're so incredibly different. Mine's a nonfiction that's divided by topics, like legal documentation, grief, end of life, talking to children about Alzheimer's, traveling with your Alzheimer's companion, and there's a memoir section that describes how we address things in our relationship and in her life, and then a research tip sections, and then my mom was a poet, so there's one of her poems in between each, but it's a work of nonfiction.
I don't know if anybody came to my reading yesterday. I wrote a novel about a real-life journey with Alzheimer's, and I chose to do that because I'm both a fiction and nonfiction writer, but I felt like the only way I could get a handle on the devastation of this disease was to back away from it and write it as literature. So that's what I did. It was my way of dealing with trauma. Which was fairly profound. I had a very broken relationship with my mother. I was the only child who decided to step up in a serious way. And also, like Mary, there was denial, of course. My mother was actually an alcoholic. And so we thought she was just ranting and raving at night on the phone because she was drunk. But it turned out when they dried her out, she was well into Alzheimer's. So I wanted to write a novel about a mother and a daughter, but I didn't want it to just be us. I wanted it to feel more universal. And so that's what I did. There's a lot of truth in the book, things that really happened, and there's also symbolism and metaphor explaining the relationships in general And Shiva, for people who don't know it, is the Jewish mourning period. So when someone close, intimate family member dies, you have a week-long mourning with specific prescriptions of how to behave as the family, with God, with prayer. And so I decided to use that as my conceit, to divide the novel into 7 sections, 7 chapters with sections about, and use those as a jumping off point for, 1, talking about grieving and mourning, and number 2, discussing the relationship of the family members, most specifically the daughter, who is the narrator, and the mother. So.
Yeah, and Lisa, when did you start writing your book? Did you always know that you wanted to write this book?
I don't think so. I think I'd written lots of things, and I was always writing, so it wasn't, and I had been trying to sort of write a family novel, because I have some astonishing stories, which other people do too, but I just didn't want to do a memoir. I wanted to do something less grounded, maybe more fanciful, more creative. So my mother was diagnosed. We realized my grandmother had dementia. I found out that my great-grandmother, my paternal grandmother's mother, had not died of tuberculosis. She died at a mental institution of melancholy. So there was all these stuff, and this was, finding this out very late. And I thought these stories need to be told. So it's, in a sense, it's also a generational tale. But I think I was always thinking about writing about the mothers, but I didn't know how until I wrote Shiva. And that's pulled what I thought together.
And one thing you said just made something pop in my head, which was that we were told after my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's not to discuss it, not to tell anyone. It was family information, and that was done out of a place of love, and an effort to protect her. But I've often thought in retrospect, was that really the right thing to do? Because we sort of denied her, in an effort to protect her, we may have denied her the ability to say goodbye to her friends, or for her friends to, have meaningful communications with her. So that after my father passed away, people came over to the house and she was super loopy, and they were kind of looking at me like, what? Like, what is going on? So I got a phone call after every visitor saying, we think you might want to, go call your mom's doctor, something's going on. And then it was like, okay, well, I need to just tell you what's going on. But it makes me think of cancer, right? Like 20 years ago, nobody wanted to talk about cancer. Nobody wanted to talk about cancer, but now that people are talking about it, people are being open about it, one thing by my book, I want to help break that stigma. A friend of mine had this great analogy. She said, if you were in the grocery store and you saw a toddler like screaming, every person there, or most people I think, would look, and if you're a parent, you'd say, oh man, I've been there. Like I've been there with that toddler screaming, like that mom's having a hard time. But you still, when you see an adult caregiver with, a mom or a spouse or a dad or something, there's still a different kind of reaction to that. So I think it's just really important to talk about Alzheimer's. I mean, it's so common. It kills more people than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. And according to the Alzheimer's Association, 1 in 3 seniors is going to pass away from it. I hope I didn't just totally bring us all down here, but
Well, considering we're all living a lot longer, I constantly remind myself that were this 100 years ago, I would have died in childbirth with my son. I had a very difficult delivery. I had an emergency C-section. We both would have died. And, by 40, 45, women had worn themselves out having children, and they didn't go to be old ladies. And there are more women than men with Alzheimer's because they live longer. But yeah, it's just it's different now. When you live to be 70, 80, 90, something's going to get you. And but it's scary. Alzheimer's is scary when it's happened in your family.
When you grieve and you think about your mother, do you see the mother from your youth, or do you see the mother during her disease?
I have to make a big effort to see the mother before, even though she's been dead for 4 years. Yeah, it's hard to get that. She was sick for 15 years, so I saw her waste away for 15 years. So trying to remember her as this beautiful, electric, insane woman is hard, because it was a lot of. It was just a long journey. A long journey.
I would say for me, immediately after, I couldn't get, I feel like I had so many different relationships with my mother. I don't know if other people who have been touched by Alzheimer's have that feeling. Like, there was my mom, and then there was Jane. And in fact, one of my siblings stopped calling my mother Mom. He started calling her Jane, because I think that was his way of differentiating. And then at the end, there was baby Jane, but they're all my mom. And I realized after she passed away that I had not spent any time looking at photographs of her in her youth. And so I took all the photos that I could find, and I think that that was very helpful for me, just to remember, I'd been so consumed by being in the disease with her. And even though I had been told by learned people that when she passed away, I would feel this great sense of relief because your loved one has been suffering for such a long period of time. I did not feel that at all.
Nor did I.
Not at all. Yeah.
Nor did I.
But I've talked to people who did feel that. So, and grief is just different for every person. But I kept waiting for this sense of relief, And then it's like, Alzheimer's, you stole something else from me. Like people told me I was going to have that, and I didn't have it.
Well, they also stole the goodbye.
Yes.
So when my mother was first diagnosed, we realized she couldn't go back to her house. It was that serious, and so my sister and I had to clean out the house and get it ready for to sell and find her a place to go. And this, you just remind me of this. So huge. My mother was a bit of a hoarder, but it was kept in the closet so you didn't see it. Huge trove of pictures. And she was rather vain, and a lot of these pictures were her. She traveled all over the world by herself often, and she had a very interesting, exciting life. So I decided to make her a scrapbook. So it started with pictures of her parents and her sisters and her, and it went up. It was, biographical to her children, our children, and her best friends, her trips, the house she lived in. And so I made this big scrapbook. And it stayed with her at assisted living. And every time I went, we'd sit on the couch and I'd say, look at you with Mimi, look at you with us. Oh, look, who are these girls? Are these girls your girls? And when my kids went, we'd sit together. It gave us something to do to occupy her and also try to stimulate her a little bit. But so I did have pictures of her youth and her beauty, but it just deteriorated so fast. I think it was hard to get over that. But the scrapbook was good, was healthy, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in my book I tried to include things like that, like practical tips for things that you could do with your loved one, or communication tips with your loved one, and documentation that would be helpful, if you're taking over the care of your loved one,
Right.
to make sure their wishes are, carried out. And I think one gift that her doctor gave us, which I included as a tip in the book, was he was always looking one step ahead. Like, what's the next thing we need to be thinking about? Because Alzheimer's, you have no control over it, which I think is one of the hardest things about it. You don't know how long it's going to last. You don't know what the trajectory is going to look like.
No.
You can find moments of humor. You can. Like, to be a resilient caregiver, I think you've got to grab on to those humorous moments and just enjoy it. I forgot. Oh, that's kind of scary because I just forgot my train of thought there. And this is a talk about Alzheimer's. But yeah, but we were always looking kind of, what can we do one step ahead? What's the next thing? Oh, the next thing is she's probably going to have to move. You know, okay, so let's.
You need to be prepared for that.
Yeah, so let's figure out what's going to be our plan when she needs to move. The next step is she may not be able to eat. So what's going to be our plan when she can't? And I have two older brothers. One's out of state. You know, one's in Houston, but was not too helpful. You know, and so figuring out a way. Somebody said to me yesterday, I feel so guilty because I live out of state and I'm not doing enough. But I think there are ways that you can figure out how those out-of-state relatives can really add a lot of value. You know, you just have to sort of figure out, you have to accept the fact they're never going to be there with you unless they come a few times a year and they're there for that period of time. But there are other things that they could do, like research, you know, that could be very helpful for you and save you a lot of time. But it just kind of takes strategic thinking.
Yeah, one of the things we did was for the first 2-3 years when Mom was at assisted living and was, you know, I don't know, was able to live a semi-normal life. My sisters and I once every 3 weeks had this huge bouquet of flowers delivered to her because she loved gardening and had really missed her garden. And my middle sister, who couldn't seem to do anything else, she was the one that organized it. And I said, all right, that's your job. Make sure that she gets flowers every 3 weeks. They're delivered, they're pretty, etc. So, and it was a great pleasure to my mother when we'd go visit her. There'd be these sticky notes all over the room. Would be, and about half of them would say, "Thank the girls for the flowers. Thank the girls for the flowers. Thank the girls for the flowers." So, so that was something that they could do. She could do.
And the other thing is, don't feel guilty.
That doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah, like, so just right now, Lisa's talking about the flowers, and you know, I always tell my kids, and I put in my book, if you try your best and you really try your hardest, then you can feel proud. You shouldn't feel guilty. But just now, Lisa's talking about that, and I'm thinking to myself,
Why didn't I give my mother flowers?
why didn't I give my mother? That would have been such an easy, good thing to do. Like the brother in college. But then I have to train my brain to say, you know, you did a good job. Like, it's okay. Just because she didn't have an organized bathroom or she ran out of supplies on a Sunday night and she didn't get flowers, like, doesn't mean you loved her any less.
No,
you know?
it absolutely doesn't.
Yeah. So I think that's I don't know, that's kind of one of the things. My book, I tried to write it in a positive tone, you know, to have some laughs, to cry maybe a little too, because that's the nature of the disease, right? But to, above all, be practical.
Yeah, I mean, it made me think about the funny story. I do think you need to pay attention to this. My mother was a snob, and she listened to very good music and read, you know, copiously, et cetera, and she was snobby about taste. And when she had moved to the memory unit, so this is the last 4 years of her life before she went to a nursing home and then to hospice, but she had to move to the memory unit, and which means, you know, you're much worse off. And several times when I visited her, there'd be this guy who'd come in and he'd have this, I don't know, portable synthesizer thing and a microphone, and he would sing show tunes. And I mean, in a former life, my mother would have made horrific fun of him, and he was absolutely awful. But so I'm sitting there just trying not to burst out laughing, and she's tapping her foot and moving around, and I'm going, oh, Mom, you would be so embarrassed by yourself if you could see this now. But I'll never forget it. It was just one of those moments, and I thought, oh, my God, you would have just turned around and walked out. But, you know, it infantilizes you, which is a terrible and sad thing. But the people who are taking care of you just have to sort of accept that.
Yeah, that's how I feel about the Hallmark Channel. I'm sorry if anyone likes the Hallmark Channel, but she would never have watched like that, and she loved it. Like, she just loved it.
Fantasy love stories.
Fantasy love stories. Yeah.
Yes.
A friend of mine recently said to me, it's a sure sign of Alzheimer's if you pick up loose change. That's an example of, I thought it was kind of funny.
Like on the floor?
Yeah, if you pick up loose change, that's a sure sign that you're getting Alzheimer's.
What?
Do you have other kind of humorous anecdotes about that in your writings or misinformation?
Oh, misinformation, yeah. 'Cause I was
So-
thinking, I've been picking up pennies since I was a kid. I don't know. I'm ready to go.
So I know people who are smelling peanut butter because apparently if you smell it more out of one nostril than the other,
Yeah, it's one of those new things.
then that could be a sign. So, like, seriously smelling peanut butter. And it's just so hard to say, well, does it depend on the brand? I mean, is your left like more for Jif or, and flashing lights. There was some study about staring at flashing lights, and I think that there's an app you can get, and you can stare at the flashing lights for so many hours per day. And of course, diet. There
Well,
are
yeah,
a lot
for a while they said don't eat anything out of aluminum pans. Do you remember that?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I may have mentioned it somewhere, but I think in the case of what I think is interesting is one of the first, Mary said she didn't talk about this, but I did because my mother immediately went into care, and I had to tell people what was going on, and they were all like, "Oh, well, I've heard as long as you do the New York Times crossword puzzle every week, you'll be fine." I'm like, my mother did it in ink for 50 years. Do not tell me, she'll be fine. And she traveled by herself, and she read books on subjects that she didn't know anything about. So all those things that are supposed to be brain stimulators, and she had different hobbies, and she walked, and she worked, and, if anybody was a candidate, it wasn't her, according to all the things that sort of illustrate that. So, and so I don't feel guilty that I can't do the puzzle in ink. But yeah, I mean, those are all myths. And now, I don't know if you've been keeping up with this, and I think it's really important, and I actually think that makes our books more important, is the research into the disease is compromised grossly now. All the things they think they knew about Alzheimer's, many were falsified. It reminds me of the old vaccination issue where it was, a man said it was, caused autism, and then they found out that was faulty data. So I don't even know if the plaques and tangles theory is still on target. My mother was given 2 different drugs, which were supposed to slow the progression. They didn't. I don't think we're really, despite the prevalence and despite the predictions of the numbers of us in this room who may end up like that, I just think we sort of have to just understand the disease as it is, realize that, like, for instance, ALS, it has no cure, it has a finite amount of time. It could be 5 years or 15 years. If it's early onset, it's usually 2 or 3 years. But you just need to look at it and say, okay, none of us is getting out of this alive. So this is what the disease is. Recognize it, read about it, and consider your own personal relationship with it. What would you do if this happened to you? Because I just don't feel like, when I was writing my book, I had, in the novel, I have a detail, a conversation I have with a physician that lived next door to my mother, and he said, "Oh, I heard about your mom, and I'm really sorry." And he said, was commiserating. He says, "Don't worry." He said, "By the time you get it, we'll have a cure." So that was 18 years ago. We are no damn closer to a cure than we were 18 years ago. And I remember cynically thinking, "Now you're full of shit." But I was right. And so I don't mean to be Debbie Downer. It's not my job. I wrote a novel about a relationship and about illness and about bereavement and about grief and about science and about spirituality. But I do think that one of the things I make clear, and definitely one of the things she makes clear, is when this happens, have a plan. Have a plan. We were thrown into a tizzy. She could not live alone. She could not live in her house. We couldn't find an assisted living place that would take her right away. And then when she got so bad she had to go to nursing home, that was another journey in trying to find a place for her. So that's where your energy needs to be, not on worrying about how to cure it, if you have it, how to diagnose it. I think when we all get it, or if we all get it, we'll know. But I think that's not the thing to focus on. I don't mean to be lecturing, but I just think it's not going to do anybody any good. It's how you deal with it when it happens.
So
She may disagree.
Well, so two things. I wish I had included a chapter about those things in my book because that would have been hilarious, you know? And now I'm going to go look up more things that people are doing. So thank you. And I think, well, I think it's important to plan for the future. I like to say, plan for the future, don't live in the future.
Right, absolutely.
And caretaking with your loved one, you know, because like I spent a lot of time after my mom was diagnosed reading about all the steps and thinking like, okay, where is she? Like, when is she going to be doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, she was doing that again. But I am much more hopeful than Lisa is because I do believe that there are reasons to hope. You know, I mean, I think it's important to plan, you know, have your documentation, you know, ready. And my mother also she put flax on her cereal. She was bringing me her fat pants, you know, because she had a beautiful figure and she lifted weights, showing me her muscles. And she did everything, you know, the right way. But there are more drugs in trial phases than ever before right now. There was a recent study done on humans after death on their brains, not just on, you know, mice or whatever it was that they were using. And there's more money being funneled towards the fight against Alzheimer's than ever before. And just the optimist in me, I think that there are reasons to hope. Yeah.
I mean, I figure if I get as many years as my mom, I'm okay going out. But I did donate my mother's brain to research. She lived in Rhode Island, and Brown University, which is my alma mater and hers, is doing cutting-edge research on dementia and Alzheimer's. And my mother also had Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's. And so before she, you know, my sisters and I just decided, because she couldn't, we said we are going to donate her brain, and we made arrangements. And I think that's something very positive to do. I mean, she died in hospice. They came and got her, took her brain, and gave us the body back. And in Jewish fashion, we buried her in 24 hours. And so, yeah, it's not like I just gave up. Never. And you know, we took her on trips, and I think in the context, I never gave up on my relationship with her, but I think focusing on a cure is just counterintuitive. I mean, especially if you're in it. I mean, it's exhausting to take care of someone with this disease. And you're tough and you think, oh, I'm fine, and then you just collapse. So you have to take care of yourself in the process. And so being consumed by next steps and by things, it's not going to help. And it's exhausting. Even if you don't do it full time, even if she's not, or he is not in your house. And then there's, you know, the phone calls. Like, I was in Budapest in my novel. I get a phone call from the memory unit. I'm like sitting in a cafe. They knew I was out of the country. I'm like, what? So I'm just sitting there crying in a cafe in Budapest because she'd had an episode. So you really don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. But I'm just realistic. I'm not a pessimist. I'm just realistic, you know?
Yes.
I've been volunteering at Edward Memory Care for over 4 years now. I play music. Yeah, I got to tell you, I've done other volunteer work. Nothing happenstance. And I was a little worried when I first went out working for hospice doing this, because you don't know how you're going to react to people who have Alzheimer's. But I've learned how to get silly with them. And
Yeah.
the music, some of them know the words better than me.
Oh, they do.
My-
That's a nice
yes,
thing to go.
my
It is,
mom,
yeah.
we always sang "You Are My Sunshine," and that just stuck with her.
And
You
I
know?
got one story I'll tell you.
Yeah.
It's so silly. The first time I went in there, I'm playing. The guy comes out with a walker. He looks at me and he goes. And I'm thinking, whoa. So I keep on playing. He goes and he sits down. He started pointing at the door. I pointed at the door. So I got done playing, and he said, "Hey, Scott, come on over there." I go over there, and he said, "You know, you did all right." Yeah. He said he wants some candy. I said, "Sure, I'll take some candy." He pulled some Skittles out of his pocket, hands it to me. He says, "Oh, by the way, one of them's got poison in it."
Oh my God, so funny.
But that's the kind of silly
Yeah.
stuff, and I'll tell you, I totally enjoy it. Yeah, it's 80% turnover since I started there. More people would have passed. You know, I've gotten kind of used to that, and just try to bring some quality in there. I've had people come and tell me I'm the best thing happens all week.
No, I believe it.
And the staff at those places, like what you just said, it's, you know, the job they do, I mean, it's just amazing how dedicated they are.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no,
Yeah, I remember one time.
taking care of it was
Yeah,
amazing.
one time I went to visit my mother, and everybody was just engrossed in this movie. And I was like, oh, okay. So I sat down, and I'm looking around, and everyone's like, you know, kind of looking, and it was in Spanish. And I looked at her, and I said, "Mom, you working on your Spanish?" Little, you know? And she, like, all of a sudden, I guess, something, and she just started laughing. It was just, like, the funniest thing. And the pal who was there, you know, she was like, "Oh, you know, I'm so sorry." I was like, "No, you know, don't change it." I mean, and there was one day when they highlighted her. They highlighted every resident. And this is kind of funny. This poem's in my book of hers. So my brother did, you know, all the preparation for the highlighting. Like, he had sent in these pictures, and they had made these beautiful, like, things, and I was there to talk about her life, right? Which nobody was really comprehending what I was saying, but I was sitting next to Mom, and, like, I would say things like, you know, and she was a writer, and she was like, "Really?" You know? And I was like, "Yeah." And I had left work, and I was in such a hurry, and I printed out this one poem of hers, and I didn't read it before I brought it with me, and it's called Prunings. And it's like about her mother, and the last lines are like, "Do not take silence for silence." I mean, it's like pretty, like, strong. And I read it, and as I was reading it, I was like, "Oh, I should have picked another one. Like, I don't know if this is really appropriate for this crowd." And I finished, and the pals were all just like, like, just like, what? And my mother was just so thrilled to know that she was a writer. And then she took the microphone and just started making loud, weird sounds into it, and, like, laughing hysterically. And I was like, okay. But yeah, it's right. I think the music, and I was always so thankful for the people at the memory,
Yeah,
you know, care.
they're amazing.
You know, another time I did go in, and they were listening to, like, rap or something while they ate. And I did mention that to the place where Mom lived, because I was like, I think it should just be calm, you know. Although I did stop going to visit her at like 4 or 5 in the afternoon, because she didn't have a lot of sundowning, but other people did.
Mm.
And it was just too upsetting, you know, to be around that. And that's okay, you know. I was always very thankful. She had a period of time when she, you know, she'd always been calm. She had a period of time when she was, like, trying to bite people.
Yeah.
And, you know, not really knowing what was going on. And that, I remember that was just so painful.
It was.
That discussion. And then I know, you know, doctors, you know, people who write essays, they talk about how bad it is to give all the psychotics, and our loved ones are over-medicated. But for her, that little bit of a psychotic
Oh, yeah.
really
It actually was
helped.
antipsychotic.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, no, my mother had to go
antipsychotic.
on those too,
Yeah,
yeah.
really helped her. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor.
Well, no, it's,
Whatever.
you don't want to just throw pills into them, and so we stopped, our normal old people meds, we stopped those and stopped the Aricept when we realized it wasn't working. But yeah, this Seroquel is something they put people on, and yeah, my mother would grab her caregiver's arms and just pinch them. I mean, bruises, and she didn't mean to, but she just couldn't. And I don't blame her. She just didn't want anybody to shower her, to touch her. It was a very invasive for her. And she got angry. And so I would go and I just listened to her scream while she was being bathed, which is really not fun. Yeah. So, I mean, you don't want them to be dangerous to themselves or other people. And it happens. Definitely happens. Yeah. Please do.
Yeah, and does anybody have any questions or?
Well, yeah, hi everyone. If you trickled in a little later, I'm Eliza. I'm a volunteer here. And I'm so grateful for this panel. I was telling Lisa and Mary, I'm in the early stages. My mom has dementia, and I'm in the early stages of kind of experiencing caretaking. This event is being recorded for MCAT, and if you have a question, I'd love to repeat it for the recording. If you have an anecdote, we'd love to hear it, and I would just love to pass you the mic so that the recording can pick it up. But I first wanted to ask Lisa and Mary, I'll kick us off. For anyone who's interested in writing about their experience, you wrote, Mary, you wrote nonfiction. Lisa, you wrote fiction, and I'd be curious to hear what you got out of that experience, just what your experience about writing in your different genres was like.
I don't know if, for me, I needed to get distance from my family. I needed to be free to describe them as I wished and not as who they were. So that's why I chose fiction. I think I've written memoir, essay about my mother, and it's hard. And somebody asked me last night if my mother ever knew I was writing this book. No, she didn't. She wouldn't have been able to. But I'm conscious of the fact that other family members have read it. But for me, fiction, to write literary fiction about her, I was trying to explore things bigger than the disease. Metaphysical questions, spiritual questions, existential questions. So I found that I could do that using her disease as a metaphor, but also as something that, when something devastating happens, you do rearrange yourself, your own self, and so that's why I did it the way I did it.
Yeah, so I actually didn't start out writing a book. I was just looking for a way to deal with my grief, and someone I talked to suggested that I start writing. And so I did start writing just for myself, and I found, because it was me, COVID, in the house with 2 teenage sons, and there's a limit, right? Like, my kids are my counselors. They would not be good ones. No, I'm just kidding. They'd be great. But so I just started writing for myself just to deal with that grief, to get the feelings out, because I didn't really have anybody else around. And then when I showed it to someone, he said, this could be very helpful for people if you write about your experience. And so I just kept writing, and I still wasn't really thinking about a book. It was just, like a challenge, right? Let's see if I can get to so many words, or let's see if I can write a book. And then when I submitted it and the publisher said, we're interested, it needs a lot of work. Like, I had it kind of in a linear fashion. Like, I had to sort of move everything around, and I went all the way to her deathbed, which terrified me. Like, the book is very authentic. It's very real. It's like, I told somebody it's me on a platter, for all to consume. You may like it, you may not like it, not everybody's going to relate to it, and I was terrified what my siblings and family members would think of it. But I felt like it was really important to go all the way there because the experience was different than what I thought it would be like, and how do you deal with that grief after you've, for me, caretaking became such an important part of me, you know? And then all of a sudden the kids are leaving, mom's not there for me to take care of. And I had a job and everything, but it's very hard. So I wanted to explore that, what happens, like this person you love dies and you're so used to like being in the store. Okay, what does mom need? Like, so I really wanted to talk about that because I thought it would be helpful. And my mom was a very empathetic, loving person, and I don't really know how happy she'd be about a book about her Alzheimer's, but I know that she'd be really happy about if it helps somebody, and I know she'd be thrilled about having her poetry published. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or stories? Yeah.
I've been a caregiver for a few years. My husband just freshly passed away in July.
So sorry.
Alzheimer's. So I have a lot of experience, but I would like to point out that the library hosts the Memory Cafe. Sure.
Yeah, you can hold it down. It's pretty loud.
The library does host the Memory Cafe monthly, and my husband, he started painting when he got his diagnosis in 2020. So he just fell in love with acrylic painting, and the library did an exhibit of his painting, and he did a virtual memory cafe.
Oh, that's
So
wonderful.
to see him, he had lots of limitations when he did his virtual cafe, but if you take a look at that, it'll tell you a lot of where he was.
Thank you so much. So resource sharing about the Memory
could
Cafe.
you share where, I would love to look at what he painted. Is there a way to look it up? Oh, okay.
So the Missoula Public Library offers a service, I think, the Memory Cafe, which is both, I believe, for caretakers and those experiencing memory loss. And this guest was talking about her husband getting into acrylic painting and that kind of thing. And so you can look that up at the Missoula Public Library or perhaps in your community or local library as well. Thank you. That's a great resource.
Oh,
It's
great.
recorded, yeah. Anyone else?
I guess everybody has to choose how to deal with this. I think that's cool, and sometimes I think I wonder if I would have benefited from some sort of group. But my mother's sister lived in this where, obviously also elderly and going blind, but she lived in the same town where my mother was in care, and so when I went up to visit my mother for a week plus, 5 or 6 times a year, I'd stay with my aunt, and sometimes I'd bring mom to the house for a few days or a few hours. But I had her when I got back from visiting mom. We would sit and have a cocktail and talk and cry. And so that was like my debriefing, I guess. I do think it's important to have someone sympathetic, empathetic, that you can bounce things off of. It's a therapist or a group or a family member. But I really think we kept each other sane. And we've always been really close. But having her and a home and a bed to go to after this trauma was very, because I was doing it long distance. My mother, her decision was to stay up north, and I couldn't persuade her to move down south. So I do think that you need someplace or someone to pay attention to what you're doing and how you're grieving.
Yeah, I never went to any type of grieving group or anything. Too busy. But I do want to say there's some really good podcasts. Love Conquers Alls is a really great one by Susie Singer Carter. She also did an Oscar-nominated film that's really funny. It has Rhoda, and it's about Alzheimer's and it's 20 minutes, the journey with her mother, but Love Conquers Alls is just a great, positive resource, and Lori LeBay does a lot on her website. She's another kind of Alzheimer's influencer. But I do think it's helpful. Books, I think, were helpful. I read Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. That was like hugely helpful for me. Especially there's something in her book about how you can't live in the photograph. Your loved one wants you to step out of the photograph, and that's very hard to do because, I really liked all those photos. Like, I want to be in the photos, but how you have to, like, make yourself kind of smile, even if you don't feel like it at first.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have endless ones, but I want to open it to the floor. Yeah.
You guys kind of touched on it a little bit already, but do you have any advice for dealing with like your siblings when you're going through figuring out care and stuff like that? Because my parents just went through that with my mom's siblings, and it was very strifeful. So anticipating their care in the future and my siblings, I'm just curious if you guys have any advice or anything, words of wisdom for dealing with that.
Yeah, that can be really tough. And I was the one closest in geography and who saw my mother the most. And, I would talk to her doctor. Maybe her doctor would say, you need to think about this. Or maybe I'd come to my own realization, like, Mom needs to go somewhere that's not home. And when I would mention that to siblings, they would, what are you talking about? Like, that she doesn't need, there was a lot of, and I learned that, at least for us, I would have to mention it. I would have to let it sit there for a while. They would need to I would say, well, why don't you come down for a few days and spend the day with Mom? Like, they would need to kind of get there on their own. And it was very, like, jarring for me to suggest certain things to them. And then I felt like, I'll admit it, at the beginning, I was a little, like, mad, because I was like, you people aren't, come on, but then I think I just had to come to terms that the guy who lives out of state is just not going to be the same kind of caregiver that I am who's here. And so I really owe him some gratitude, because I think he sort of figured that out too, and he sort of started suggesting things that he thought he could do. Because when people said, Mary, do you need help? Do you need help? I would always say, no, I got it. Because who wants to say, I really need some help here, I'm really struggling. But he started suggesting ways that he thought he could help. And once we sort of got into that cadence, it became a lot easier, because I just knew, okay, he's not going to be able to help me in this way, but I know he can do all of these other things. And then when you're the legally empowered person, there's certain things that other people can't do that you just have to do. And I think sometimes with siblings, they don't understand that, but you're the only person the doctor will talk to. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful, but, I think I wish in retrospect, my brother read my book and he said, I had no idea that you felt so alone, and of course he's feeling guilty, which I'm like, well, this is not helpful. I'm like, and that was not my intention. But I think I wish I would have articulated more that, this is really tough. I wish you all could think of a way that you could help me. Like, I'm having trouble just keeping all the balls up in the air, trying not to start a nightly wine habit here, So I think I wish I had just sat down with them and just been honest about it.
I do think you have to do that. I'm just trying to think, was there some thing that goes, the person to whom it matters is the person who needs to do it. So if you're angry at your husband for not doing the dishes, but he doesn't care about the dishes, then you're probably going to have to do the dishes. So, and it's something you learn when you're a grown up. But in terms of caregiving, my uncle, we made my mother's brother-in-law. He was a CPA, so he had, financial. He did the financials, which was great. He'd always done her taxes, and so he dealt with all that stuff. And I was the point person for all the doctor's questions, for all the caregivers' questions. I'm not really sure why, but mainly because I could do it, and it didn't feel onerous to me. It felt like something that needed to be done, and I could do it, which is why they called me Budapest. But so yeah, there has to. My middle sister did almost nothing. My baby sister and I moved her 5 times, and we just had to accept that that was the way it was. And she was great at that stuff, my younger sister, but not so great at the other stuff. So I just took it on. I mean, somebody has to do it. And I understood the reasons that they didn't want to be involved. They were more historical. And you always have to take that into consideration. What are the relationships of the children or the relatives to the person that's sick? Yeah. And if they can't come to terms with them, then you can't force them. But there has to be somebody who steps up, and it's exhausting and lonely, and sometimes you feel resentful, but you just have to do it.
My, the third sibling, different people take the news of Alzheimer's and the changing relationship with their loved one in different ways. But he was going to church every Sunday anyway. And so that was, we suggested, why don't you just come and pick Mom up and take her to church and out to lunch, And that sounds like a little thing, but that was so nice for her. And she really enjoyed it. She enjoyed the music, and it was something that fit into what he was doing in his life anyway. Yeah. And so that was kind of, I started looking for things, okay, I'm going to think about what you do and what your wife does, and then I'm going to try to think of ways that we can kind of fit into that. Yeah. Anyway.
I do. I'm trying to decide which one. You've talked about the changing relationships. And that's something that I'm thinking about a lot now. You've talked about the photographs and thinking about the former mom. I got a photograph of my young mom in college tattooed on me because I just wanted to remember that like she was young and vibrant and fun before all of this was happening. And I think what the stage that I'm in right now is trying to figure out how to have a relationship with her when she's so different, and she's happy. Someone called it Mary dementia the other day, MERRY, where she doesn't know what she used to be like, and so she's perfectly happy. But I'm kind of reckoning with how she has changed, and I'd be curious to know. I imagine that there are many of these phases to go through, and I don't know if you can talk about your experience of recalibrating that relationship over and over again.
I really think that's almost the hardest part. So they're just not there anymore. They're not the person. And you have to come up with a way of being with that new person. And I don't know, my mother was gorgeous and literate and, and a terrible snob and also very funny. But that person was gone really fast. So it's on you to create a different relationship with that person. You need to just, so the thing about Alzheimer's is that it's a constant mourning, okay? It's not, oh, my husband died, got run over by a car, or, oh, my sister died of cancer. It's not, it's a 15 or 10-year period where everything that changes and every loss you have to mourn it again. And that's hard. but also you have to just accept it. It's not coming back. And, we were all beautiful once, right? I mean, everybody, there's this picture going around on the interwebs, and it's got these 4 young women with long hair parted in the middle, and they've got on hip hugger jeans and crop tops, and they're leaning against a car, and it says, "Nobody will ever be as cool as your grandmother was." And that's my generation. That's my, that's exactly that. And I just remember looking at it and laughing and said, yeah, your kids and grandkids don't have any perception of you as this young, hip chick, hanging out in a sport with a sports car. So, but you just have to love her as she is now. It's hard, but what are you going to do? You can't fight it. It's not fightable. Pick your battles.
Yeah, I think you have to meet your loved one where she is. Although I will say, I always felt like my mom's essence was always there. Like, she went through all these different kind of personalities, but she still liked listening to jazz. She still liked flowers and gardening. She still liked books, so we would, sit and look at, an easy book together, just sit together. But that is, I think, the hardest part, And then occasionally you might have a flash of a remembrance that comes back. And when that happened, I would think, oh my gosh, here she is. Okay, let's ask a bunch of questions. Like, I can get you back, And I think she just got so sick of me, she would finally, figure out what I wanted to hear and say, yeah. But somebody told me you have to put the disease in front of the person. So, when you see that flash of, oh my gosh, here she is, you have to just be thankful for that moment and embrace it and think, gosh, I have such gratitude that, I got to experience that. But then accept that, after the diagnosis, I didn't really allow myself to continuously grieve because I thought, she's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. All of these things are an outshoot of her Alzheimer's. So why am I continually you've already grieved it, but that's just not how it works. So just let yourself go through those emotions. And I wish I had a better answer.
I appreciate that. There was a moment my grandmother had Alzheimer's and she was very spunky and there was a moment when it was pretty late in the disease and we were in the nursing home together and she just looked out, something silly was on TV and she just looked at me out of the corner of her eye and winked. And I was like, oh, hi. I haven't seen you in a minute. And it was really great to see her. I know we're wrapping up. I wondered if you each would I'm throwing this at you on the spot, but would like to share a quick happy memory of your mother's from the pre-Alzheimer's days or even during, I loved hearing about them and just to hold them as who they are and kind of bring them into the room.
Well, this is in my novel, and I love this story. So, as I said, my mother was an alcoholic, and first she went into assisted living, and she would still buy wine and drink it, and we let her do it, although there was some dissent among the family members whether that was a good thing or not. And she got quite tipsy a couple of times, and so my uncle came up with this idea of the airline bottles of wine and just making sure that she had 2 of those every evening. And so that was excellent. And then I was going to go up. This is in my novel, which is, I'm not going to do justice to it. It's a really terrific story. But I was going to fly up to Rhode Island and get my mother and bring her back for several days to my house in Virginia where she could see my sister, my children, and we would all hang out together for a while. And again, they were like, are you sure you want to do this? I'm like, yes, I can do this. It was her very last trip. So that's a long, complicated aspect to the trip, but we get to my house, and she had a certain cheap Chardonnay that she liked. And so we bought the bottle and poured it out and filled it with non-alcoholic wine and put it in the fridge. And so she could just go and help herself anytime she wanted a glass of wine, and nobody said anything to her. And we sat and talked to her, and she would say, "Oh, I'll have another glass of wine." Okay, fine. And we kept filling up the same bottle with the non-alcoholic wine, and we got through 5 days, and it was fabulous. And eventually, probably another year or two later, she actually forgot to drink. She forgot that she was an alcoholic, so that went away. But it made the trip so less fraught for us, and she had no idea that she wasn't drinking real alcohol, but it gave her some, some power, right, to go to the fridge and get her own glass, and it was great. It was just great. We didn't have to worry about her because, people get drunk, they behave badly anyway, but so with Alzheimer's, you could imagine the havoc that can be wreaked. So anyway, that's one of my favorite stories. We've come up with ways to trick her, but it was... It was for a good reason. It was definitely for a good reason.
I don't know. I just miss the simple little things that I always kind of took for granted, like not one big thing sticks out, but just like all the days of like just kind of sitting and chatting about nothing and not really thinking there was anything special. But yeah, just kind of the little things. I'm watching her with my kids, who unfortunately, because they were so young, like they don't really know who she really was, because when she was still kind of a bit there, they were so young, and now they're, a lot bigger. But I think just the simple, stopping by on a Sunday for a, I don't know what, the little visit, just that. So just cherish all that.
Well, thank you so much. To Lisa and Mary, thank you all of you for being here. Please buy their books. Fact and Fiction has a table. Say hello to these two throughout the weekend as they're here. And thank you again, everyone.